I assume the reason why is to keep entrenched government happy. I like dogs and Elvis Presley too. Shirt forces from having veto power over the people's choice. The assumption is that the people wouldn't be so foolish as to elect someone so compromised. I think a good middle ground would be for all candidates to undergo a background check security clearance assessment that issues a public, non-binding recommendation, so the voters can make an informed decision and candidates can't hide compromising info, but also prevents some obscure bureaucracy from being able to veto a popular candidate for possibly corrupt reasons. You would think that would fall under happy I like dogs and two-shirt democracy and common sense. Both are becoming far less common lately. Like he certainly was in debt, but the level of theft is unbelievable. The kids are cleaning up too. How do they not have cash coming out their ears by now? Some jobs ask for your credit history. Maybe now this one has to as well. He is not in debt. He is flat out bankrupt. Not just debt, big debt. I lose my security clearance if I go into debt and don't pay. He became president. This guy can't even do rich right. How can someone that has created the system from the top chair in the land be in debt? Imagine if they had such a requirement today. Trump would have his goons block all worthy opponents by finding something in their background check. Be careful what you wish for. You need a background check to work in public schools. So this makes sense. This is a super slippery slope. Federal agencies can effectively rule out candidates they don't want. Do you realize how dystopic that is? Or are you just a brain moron? Financial background check. I would go with. Want to know how happy I like dogs and Elvis Presley two-shirt much debt or assets they are carrying, and the terms and holders of any debt they have. Since these are all Schedule 1 drugs, they'd for sure be red flags, and might put their authorization at the federal level in jeopardy. In a background check, they aren't looking for everything wrong you've done in your past, they're looking for anything that can be used as leverage over you. For example, drug use wouldn't necessarily be a problem. That is the key. If you're embarrassed to admit it can be used against you. There's literally a picture of Obama smoking what is allegedly a joint in college. They don't care. But if weed was a huge deal, or that was a picture of him shooting heroin into his arm, and someone had it, and that person could use blackmail to coerce the president, that becomes a problem. Happy I like dogs and Elvis Presley two-shirt. Ladies tee. Long-sleeved. Sweater and hoodie. Happy I like dogs and Elvis Presley two ladies tee. Ladies tee. The town looks like a post-WW2 shot of Stalingrad. Most of us just can't conceive happy I like dogs and Elvis Presley two-shirt that this happened. Because if it did, it would have been in all the news. Allah is the Arabic word for God. However, God is definitely different than God is asserting that the Islamic God is the same as the Christian God. They're just pointing out that Allah is the Arabic word for it, like you said. Like how Dieu is French for God. Yeah, and I get that. But the God people believe in is fundamentally different from the God people believe in. The op is making the point that Arabic Christians refer to their God, the Christian God, as Allah. If you speak Arabic and you believe in the Judeo-Christian God, you call him Allah. Why are we using a picture from Watchmen? I have relatives who have lived in Tulsa for decades. I only heard about this a few years ago, and it's shocking how this was hidden from history so quietly. Because John Oliver just did a segment on this subject and used imagery from Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley two-shirt Watchmen to portray it and talk about how many Americans first heard about the massacre via Watchmen. Probably it was a better visual depiction, I guess. I mean, it actually happened, but not in the right picture. It looks like it could be from here if it wasn't from Watchmen. John Oliver just released another episode of Last Week Tonight focusing on U.S. history and points out a few of the intentional my opinion gaps in its teaching in the United States. So be ready for posts about the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. John Lewis. Martin Luther King Jr. and his opinions on wealth redistribution. And a variety of other topics that looking into these could open up to you. For instance, why did that one Texas textbook put so much emphasis on slaves from America coming to Texas? Slaves were illegal in Mexico at the time. Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too long-sleeved. Long-sleeved. This post is good old-fashioned Dunning-Kruger. There is a difference here. They speak Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt of the same entity. But by using each word you add a little context to what you think that entity wants and how it should be praised, which differs quite a lot. Yes, Christians use that word, but it's pretty clear what he wanted to say here. So you are just playing dumb. I get that they're technically correct. But growing up with a lot of Muslims around me, it was always quite obvious who we meant with Allah. And who we meant with God. And it's not the same book. My dad's better than your dad. New subreddit group. It is funny how he writes God is bigger than Allah. But is he bigger than? And none show a low-flying airplane like the image above. So it is directly misleading. With so many real photos of the event. Why use one from a dramatized TV show? If anything, that makes it less believable. On one hand, I feel like they shouldn't be so obvious about it. But with Reddit being Reddit, it works. So I can't fault them for that. Honestly. Because if you use real images, people tend to not believe it. Except the photo doesn't necessarily accurately represent the event. If the images exist and it's true, then it's on them not to believe it. Not us. That's their problem if they don't believe it. Oh, I agree. It's more a comment on a society that kept this quiet and still does today. The U.S. Armed Forces wiped Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt out a small town of Americans. Because they committed the crime of being successful and black. That is so unbelievable to some that when presented with the evidence they just call it out as a lie. We do have many photos of the event and the aftermath. I get that they're technically correct. But growing up with a lot of Muslims around me, it was always quite obvious who we meant with Allah and who we meant with God. And it's not the same book. My dad's better than your dad. You idiot, dad literally means dad. New subreddit group? It is funny how he writes God is bigger than. But is he bigger than Jesus? Given the amount of blood and meat in the form of biscuits and wine that Christians eat every year, I think Jesus was bigger. Alright, so yeah. Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too sweater. Sweater. I mean that all works fine with drugs like marijuana and relatively harmless ones. But it Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt probably can't work with harder drugs like cocaine. I don't think the fact you did it once as a young person should disqualify you from anything in the present as long as you're honest about it. But making it legal probably would just end with a lot more addicts and overdoses. Maybe what they should do is decriminalize possessing it for personal use. It should only be illegal to transport, manufacture and sell, though I imagine that will have its own problems. Yeah. That's why I did use the term decriminalization, not legalization, because for the former there is a really strong case to be made and for the latter merely an interesting Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt discussion to be had. Which I'm not currently opposed to having. There are some clear problems if we were to commercialize highly addictive drugs for recreational use. I don't see it practically working out at the moment. But there could be concepts I'm not aware of that do not eventually collapse under the weight of idealism. If we can give adults the freedom to make choices for themselves without it overall affecting society and third parties negatively, then we absolutely should. In the realm of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it is the same God. All three religions are intricately linked. I learned on FB that worship a lunar deity, a black stone in Mecca while turning around the Kaaba. Am I wrong? Allah is not Yahweh. God is the English word for the kind of being that they are, not the name of the Hebrew, Christian, or Muslim deity. So the original statement, in context, makes sense. There are lots of arguments to be had among Christians, Muslims, and Jews about Yahweh and Allah being the same. I've heard liberal sects of all three make that claim, while most definitely say they aren't. Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too. Hoodie. Yeah, no block, it just needs to be public. And if they control the check, they control the Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt information released. They may not directly block, but don't think for a minute that this sort of power wouldn't provide indirect blocks by selectively releasing information. I see that the sentiment for wanting this is good, and I agree with it, but in no circumstances should a background check be a part of the political process. It just puts too much power to control the narrative in the hands of the party that control the checking agency. The Red Scares of the 1920s and 1950s should provide some insight into it. What could happen? As even the simple label Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt of socialist or communist on an opponent was an effective block to office. Now imagine if that sort of power was institutionalized in a federal agency. Oh, I'm just in favor of everything being public, not the background check itself. Guaranteed if there was a background check requirement, this admin would abuse it. Tax returns, government records, the works. The people should decide if it's relevant. The selective release is a problem though. Junior was reportedly a cocaine addict for some years during his alcoholic phase. Now, this all pales in comparison to the leverage someone has over a person. Hundreds of millions, apparently over $1 billion, possibly with interest charges in debt. That's why Donald is a puppet to someone. Most likely Putin. They have so much blackmail on Donald, they're literally able to tell him to take actions that are incredibly harmful to the US. And he can't say Happy I Like Dogs and Elvis Presley too shirt no, even if he wanted to. Drug abuse is a criterion that typically excludes you from a security clearance, but I'd still encourage the original argument because there should be a discussion that leads to the decriminalization of drugs. The reason drug abuse is a criterion is that it's illegal, and people enforcing the law cannot have a history of breaking it. And because addicts gonna addict, you should resolve this by decriminalizing recreational use. It's not the same as having a substance abuse habit, and is unfairly punishing those addicted to illegal substances when there are plenty of people with legal addictions. An alcoholic is definitely a bigger issue than a guy that smoked the occasional joint. So the question isn't for me how this would have affected Obama and Bush Jr., but how it would affect the debate on what criteria make or break a background check. Other products.